A lot of my friends on the right and a lot of my viewership may be disappointed when they find out that I don't strictly stick to right-leaning sources of news when I listen to my news for the day. Sometimes I'll go and look on CNN and find out how they're reading something. When I had satellite radio, I would often alternate between Fox News and MSNBC. While I enjoy the ramblings and the funny commentary of Trump enthusiasts Andrew Klavan and Michael Knowles, I always balance them out with the Trump fence sitting of their other friend on the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, and occasionally I'll go as far right as Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh, especially when there's big news going on in the country. But once a week, whether there's big news or whether there's little news, I also like to take some time and get as far left as I can. And last week, I decided to go on and listen to Pod Save America. There was some big news going on there, and I grabbed 3 episodes from the previous week because I wanted to hear some more of the smaller news, some of the more of the news that was getting covered up by many of the mainstreams. One of the episodes from last week featured an extensive interview with one of the co-hosts and progressive superstar Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, someone whose career I've been following very closely, especially with my enthusiasm for freshman politicians, partisan lines aside. And I took some time and I listened to the entire interview. I was less than impressed by the intelligence and the knowledge of the issues of the country. I was even less impressed by the distinct lack of knowledge that surrounded the policy prescriptions that Ocasio-Cortez is on the record for talking about. But there was one talking point that came out of the interview that actually got me to stop what I was doing and go run to Google and try and figure out what was going on. Because it seemed like a pretty massive policy prescription, and Cortez brought up the name of Kirsten Gillibrand a lot in the interview, and yet it was something that I had never heard of up until that point. It was the kind of thing that you would think that every conservative pundit would be putting wall-to-wall coverage on and talking about, and yet it's flown completely under the radar. And I'm talking today about the concept of postal banking.
Kirsten Gillibrand recently, she's one of many of the people that may run who are for single payer or Medicare for all of some form. She also just proposed a postal banking system so that people that are right now sort of subject to payday lenders who can't get the main banking system. Yeah. What do you think about postal banking?
I'm a huge fan of postal banking. I live in a neighborhood that would be enormously impacted by postal banking. I live across the street from a check cashing place. I walk 5 minutes to my subway stop. There's a payday lender. There's a pawn shop. And, postal banking and I haven't read her bill specifically, but I do know that postal banking is huge. And it would be hugely important to working class communities because there is an entire cottage industry based on capturing the income of the already working poor. You take someone who is kind of unbanked in the traditional ways. And, there are some studies that say as much as 10% of their income goes to, these processing fees of your check cashing place, your payday lender. And that is like after the fact that they aren't being they aren't even being paid enough to live to begin with. And so I think that postal banking is extremely important. I think it would be huge. I think it would be a game changer for communities like mine, for working class communities across the country. And there's a lot of really exciting policy ideas, I think, out on the horizon.
Prior to listening to that interview, I'd never heard of postal banking before, but as soon as Ocasio-Cortez said the words, I kind of had an idea of what was going on and what it was that she was planning on putting onto the American people. And I was very surprised to find out that this is actually not a new concept, and it's something that our federal government has done in the past. And I started doing some extensive research and reading on what it was. Not surprisingly, I was unable to find any real right-leaning commentary on the concept. As I said before, this is something that I absolutely expected was going to be on the forefront of every conservative commentator's shows, and it would have some wall-to-wall coverage, because it would be something that I would think that everybody in the government and everybody in the country would want to strike down. Now, postal banking is exactly what it sounds like. Gillibrand wants to put a bill onto the floor of Congress that would essentially expand the role of the post office from the delivery of mail into basic banking services. It would just be simple things like a checking account, a savings account, and the ability to get small loans, while being able to go around more traditional private industries that specialize in these things, especially for low-income communities. Now, in the interview, as we heard earlier, and in every article that I read, all of the authors and all of the speakers have always talked about payday loan stores. I'm going to come out on the record and I'm going to say that payday loan stores are a bad idea, in my opinion, to begin with, and are something that should be avoided at all costs, no matter what your situation is. For those not familiar, a payday loan store is usually a private industry that's either connected with a bank or not connected with a bank, where you can go out and get a loan based on what your paycheck is going to be. And they also have services like check cashing, where they'll give you cash, but for a small fee, usually about 10% of the check. Usually these services are limited to payroll checks. They usually won't touch a private check in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. So there's always a lot of restriction that goes on with this kind of thing. Are they predatory to people who don't have a whole lot? Yeah, they really are. And they are especially predatory to people who would otherwise not be able to get a bank account, specifically illegal immigrants. Now, I'm not going to be shy about it. I came out on the bottom. I came out of mechanic school at a point in the job market, especially in the place that I was living, where the market was absolutely flooded with mechanics. And it was hard to get a job. People were going out and hiring everybody that came in the door and keeping about the top 10% and firing everybody else within the 90 days before they had to start paying out benefits. So you'd get a gig here and there. It would pretty much be a temp gig, and then you'd be out on the street for a little while. And when I did have a regular long-term job, they were paying me as minimally as they could, and for a while they were keeping me at 25 hours a week. So it's safe to say that I was having some trouble making ends meet for a long time in the first decade. And I bring that up because the argument is that people who are on a lower income, people who are making below a certain amount of money, people who are just starting out, people in college, people on disability, whatever the excuse is, the people that are proposing this postal banking system are coming out and saying that it's impossible to get a bank account unless you are filthy rich or at least upper middle class. Anybody below that threshold will usually wind up paying massive fees that would usually cancel out anything that they plan on putting into the bank. I'm going to come out and tell you this, that this is absolutely not true. That's the first thing that I want to lead with before I go into my problems with postal banking as it is. No matter how low I got in money, I always had a bank account. There are banks out there, and they keep specific checking accounts out there for people who are starting out. I don't think I've ever had a bank account that had a minimum balance in it. Yes, there are the options of having direct deposit and requiring direct deposit. My bank account now requires me to have direct deposit in it in order to waive any fees that come with it. But as long as you're working at least part-time, you have to direct deposit a minimum of $100 a month from direct deposit into your account to waive fees. $100 a month. So anybody who can't deposit $100 a month, I can't imagine welfare is any less than that. I've never been on it, so I wouldn't be able to say. But it is not hard to keep a bank account going. There are other banks that I've banked through that have just completely free bank accounts. They don't have any fees in them. These banks are usually driven more towards savings accounts because they can make their money that way off of interest and loans. But I went for years without having any sort of fees on a bank account. So I'm going to come right out and say that if you can't get a bank account, or if your bank is pushing too many fees on you and it's forcing you to not be able to afford to keep your bank account open. It's time to go out and shop for a new bank, because there are banks out there that will help. A recommendation that I would make would be to go and find a bank near a college, because they generally have the accounts available for people who don't make much, for people who are doing a part-time barista job and just looking for a place to deposit their tips so that they can go out and online shop. But back on to postal banking. So the idea is the fact that if you go to postal banking, you will be able to open up a checking account, which is okay. I guess I have a bit of a problem with the federal government having more money than they need, or putting money into the federal government, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. You can open up a savings account and have a little bit of interest. They say that the interest rates for a savings account in postal banking won't be as high as a regular bank out there, and I have no idea how that's even possible. Most banks out there right now are offering savings accounts at under 1% interest. And you can go out and get small loans. Small loans that you would normally have to go to a payday loan store for and pay 300% interest on. The citation and the justification for this process seems to revolve around the fact that you've been able to go to the post office for years and get money orders, and due to the fact that during the Great Depression, postal banking was also offered, and it was actually utilized in great form, because most of the banks had fallen under by that point due to both lack of interest and just the state of the economy as it was at the time. Postal banking would also have limits and caps on the amount of money that you could keep into it. It is legitimately being marketed as being designed for the poor. Most of the accounts that have been proposed for postal banking have been capped at $20,000 total, which if you've got $20,000 in the bank, I don't know why you're not putting it into a bigger bank with higher interest. Talk about that a little bit later. And of course, they've talked about things like no credit check loans or limited credit check loans for higher interest, but for just smaller amounts, $300, $1,000 here and there to make a car repair. It's the car repair that they always bring up. The claim being that if, for whatever reason, you have a car breakdown and you can't go out and fix it, you suddenly can't go to work anymore and you fall out of the economy. The problems of postal banking, especially now versus the Great Depression, are completely numerous. I can't even see this as being a viable idea, and I'm not sure how it is that Gillibrand is planning on getting this through Congress, getting it across the Senate, and getting it signed by the president who is big on privatizing everything. I'm sure there's an impeachment plan in mind there, but that's a conversation for another day. I talked already about the problems with the talking points that surround postal banking. The fact that poor people can't get bank accounts or they get feed out of bank accounts. And it's just a backup plan to keep people from going to the payday loan store. We've already talked to death as to why this just isn't true and why people need to take some time and shop around and not give one bank the monopoly. But I have some other problems with this. The first one is the fact that we are in a massive national debt right now. We are at $21 trillion in national debt. I was quite expecting us to be down out of the national debt by now, and I have faith that it's going to happen, but the fact of the matter is that no matter who is in office, we are $21 trillion in debt. And this speaks specifically to savings accounts through postal banking and the small substitution to payday loans that the bill plans to force the post office to offer. The problem that I have with both of these items is the fact that I don't know where our government is going to get the money to pay the interest. I have a little bit of a problem with the fact that they're going to be paying interest on it based on the structure of banks, but I don't know where the federal government is going to be able to pay that back out. And one of the big problems with the payday loans and the people who are going to be taking out the substitutions with the payday loans is, unfortunately, with the way that the economy was prior to this year, and the people that are going to be utilizing this service, is that there's a very high risk that many of the people that are going to be taking out these loans are going to wind up defaulting on them. I know that the original proposition to this bill and the way to keep the people from going to the payday loan stores and instead going to the federal government was to offer small loans at 3%, but that was debated out to be 25% or more based on this risk factor. This is something that's already been addressed on the floor of Congress. And yes, the federal government does have ways of recouping the money if you should default on the loan. I know that many of these people, whether working or not working, tend to get very large tax returns, especially if they fall below the earned income credit. They get all of their taxes back at the end of the year. And that would be one thing for the federal government to do. They would be able to keep that tax return and use it to pay off the loan rather than just leaving the money out there. That is an option, but that's still money that's hanging out there that the federal government is losing off of its budget throughout the year. Now, the other problem that goes along with this would be the interest that goes along with the savings accounts that go with the postal banking. The proponents of the bill and the people that are proposing it are coming out and saying that they would be able to give interest on savings accounts, and as I mentioned before, they wouldn't be as high as the regular banks, but they would give the people an incentive to keep their money in the bank rather than just keeping it in cash in their pockets and spending it at will. Now, this is a good idea, and I think that more people should be keeping money in the bank. And in a perfect world and in a perfect structure, the savings accounts would function the same way that they do in a private bank. The federal government would keep a pool of money specifically in the savings accounts and use that to loan out in the small loans that they promise to give out in the proposed bill, and use the interest off of those loans to pay back the interest to the customers, keeping of course a small fee for transaction and employment, and to kick a little bit back to the government in the substitution of the profit that would go to bank presidents. Unfortunately, this is not a perfect world. One does not have to look very far in order to see what happens when certain members of the federal government look at the pool of money that is in the federal government, and it seems to be a little bit higher than what the budget or the ledger says it is. One also has to remember what happens anytime any politician out there suggests the privatization of Social Security. There's always a panic that comes from certain members of Congress and certain members of the Budget Keeping Committee when certain other people decide that they want to take that money out of the hands of the federal government, keep it out there for people to use through the federal government, but keep the pool of money out of the federal government. I was having a conversation with two coworkers last night. One of them who agrees with me on the idea of postal banking, and one of them who generally disagrees with me politically. I mentioned the fact that Social Security is insolvent, and it was designed to be insolvent because people who started paying in the year it came out could start drawing on it the year that it came out. That just set a bad model to start with. The coworker that disagrees with me actually made my next point for me. He was trying to disprove what I was saying, but inadvertently he made the next point for me. He told me that Social Security would be solvent except for certain people out there who continually borrow or steal from the Social Security fund to fund other things in the government. Borrowing from Social Security was a very big news story during the 90s. It kind of fell off the news in the recent years, but during the 90s it was a big controversy as to what budget hawks were borrowing from the Social Security fund and when they were going to pay it back. And it is a legitimate claim. All in all, that is all just money that's in the federal government. And sometimes people will borrow from that fund in order to pay the bills. I think that's wrong, and I think that's a reason that we should privatize Social Security, but that would be a video for another day as well. Unfortunately, I have a lot of the same fears, inhibitions, and worries about entire groups of people willingly putting all of their hard-earned money and their life savings and the lifeblood that they depend on into the hands of the federal government to take care of. I worry that certain politicians, maybe politicians now, maybe politicians down the road, will see this as, oh, we can borrow for this. They don't need it right away. And we'll find a way to find it back when it comes time for them to call on this money. With budget shortfalls and omnibus bills and bailouts for certain states that can't pay their bills and go and borrow money from the federal government, I can't see as this being a good idea. I think that's part of the reason that the American people demanded the tax cuts that so many of the people in the mainstream media deemed were harmful and unfair and were tyrannical from the federal government. The bottom line on postal banking and the federal government being involved in the financial affairs of certain people in our country is the fact that on paper it's a really good idea. The government usually collects a lot more money than any private bank, and it on paper would be very easy for somebody to be able to draw a little bit of interest by letting the government borrow their money. It's kind of the same idea as a bond, but it's a little bit more mass scale, and it's targeting different people than bonds would target. But like most things, it's something that had a time and a place. It is something that we've used before in the past, but it's something that I feel that our country, and especially our booming economy, has outgrown. And in 2008, it would have actually been something that probably would have been a little bit easier to sell, and maybe something that the people would have been able to use a little bit more while we were losing thousands of jobs a day in this country. But right now our economy is booming. Everybody is going back to work, and jobs like Taco Bell are begging so hard for bodies that some of them are starting people out at $15 an hour just to compete with the gas stations that are next door that are starting people at $14 an hour. There are going to be extenuating circumstances out there that keep people from being able to get jobs, and there are going to be extenuating circumstances out there that are going to keep people poor. But the private banks in this country are always willing to work with people, and they really want your money into those banks no matter how little you're putting in there, because the more money that they have in there from everybody, the more that they can loan out to people and earn their money back on the interest from the loans. Of course, giving back a little bit of interest to the people who let them borrow the money in the first place. Right now in this country, we have more jobs out there than we have bodies to fill them, and wages are going to steadily start to rise, especially if we keep up on this trend. And therefore, we're getting into a point in our economy right now where we don't need a program like postal banking, a program out there that the politicians that support it and the politicians that propose it are using in order to go out and take advantage of I misspoke that the politicians and proponents are out there trying to help the poor with. What do you think about postal banking? What do you think about putting more money into the hands of the federal government? And what do you think about banking in general, especially in this economy that we have right now? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlogTwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions.